You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We talk about veteran outreach and support a fair bit on the show, and by a fair bit, I've definitely done at least one interview on veteran outreach programs. In fact, I've done two, maybe even three. But one area we haven't covered is veteran employment. Now, I'm very, very interested and invested in veteran employment, particularly this veteran's employment. G'day, listeners, and welcome to The Dead Prussian, the only show named after a 19th military historian, or Prussian military thinker, let's call him that. And I'm Mick, the humblest host you have on the show, because I'm the only host, but I'm not going to be humbled tonight. I have one of my mentors to be interviewed tonight. But before we get to chatting with my mentor, let's talk about the new social network, the TDP Community, or the Community Hub, as you might see me called, or hashtag TDP Community. We have changed our paid subscription model, and now if you go to our website, www.thedeadprussian.com, and go to the top, let's say top right, I'm not good with my left or right, but let's go top right corner, you'll find a community button. Click on that, and then it will ask you to, take some tin out of your pocket and throw it our way. And once in the Community Hub, you can then participate in forums, group chats, and community activities, as well as access bonus content. Now, the type of community activities I'm talking about, they're not picnics, they're not Frisbee competitions, they're things like the writers group, the readers group, the monthly book club, the monthly writing sprint, which is quite good. And if you know me, you know I don't like sprinting. So if I say some type of sprint is good, then it must be good. So check it out, the TDP Community. Now, let's get back to my guest, who is watching me like a hawk, taking notes, and probably going to send me an email about how I am presenting my voice and my breathing and everything about podcasting. My guest today is Dr. Sharon Mascall-Dare. She's an adjunct associate professor at the University of South Australia and a member of the Narratives of War Research Group. She's an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and author. Her research interests are focused on the ethnographic journalism and journalistic ethics in the context of Anzac commemoration and coverage of Veterans Affairs. Her PhD at the University of South Australia in 2013 was entitled An Australian Story, Media and Memory in the Making of the Anzac Day. Sharon is a serving member of the Government of South Australia's Veterans Advisory Council and an Australian Army Reserve Public Affairs Officer, currently posted to Headquarters 9th Brigade. Her operational experience with the Australian Defence Force includes a deployment to Iraq from 2016 and 2017, where she served as the Public Relations Officer for Task Group Taji 4, and that was in Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, Taji is a place in Iraq. I know that from my extensive experience of never having been there. She is currently the honorary chair of StoryRight, the topic of today's chat, in fact, or the mechanism for the topic of today's chat, let's call it that. And that's a not-for-profit program that supports veterans' transition to civilian employment. And most importantly, Sharon's a mentor of mine when I first started this show, and we produced the Australian Army's first ever podcast together. Sharon, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Mick. Now, what is going on with that beard? Because the last time I saw you, you were still in and you didn't have a beard. So how come you've got one now?
Well, one of the benefits of being a veteran who's gone through the transition to civilian employment is that I choose when I shave, which is an absolute brilliant feeling after 18 years of having beards made illegal. So it is no longer a crime for me to be bearded. And for those listeners who haven't seen it, jump on the TDP Community because it's on my profile. We didn't even plan that, but that's a great way to advertise the show. Now, Sharon, before we start discussing veteran outreach and support, I am keen to hear about how you became interested in veteran issues.
Well, it goes back to 2011, Mick, before I decided to join the Army, in that I was doing my PhD on the subject that you just talked about, which was essentially looking at journalistic methodologies and narratives with regard to Anzac Day and the Anzac Centenary. but I still needed to earn a few bucks while I was doing my PhD. And back in those days, I was still working as a journalist. And I used to make documentaries for the BBC. And I managed to get myself the opportunity to embed inside Port Augusta Prison to follow a new rehabilitation program that was designed for young Indigenous men to try to reduce the rates of offending. And the result was a documentary called The Big House. And I know that with your background in criminology, we've actually talked about The Big House before.
Yeah.
But the key thing with The Big House, and I don't know if I actually told you this when we spoke about it before, was there was a very strong connection with Army and a very strong connection with veterans, in that the general manager of Port Augusta Prison at that time was a gentleman called John Harrison, who I believe still works in the security field. I don't know what he's doing right now, but at that time he was a general manager. And the idea of this rehabilitation program called Sierra, it was very much his concept. And what was really interesting is that not only did he trust me to actually go into that prison as a journalist and be embedded and tell the stories of those young men as they went through that process under his leadership, not only did he trust me to do that work and do it from an ethnographic perspective, where I was truly able to attempt to tell that story from an insider's perspective in terms of over a period of time as much as one can be accepted into the community, given that I was, a female Pommy Sheila, as some of them used to call me.
Yeah.
But the fact is that after hours, John and I would have these incredible discussions talking about sociology and anthropology and ethnography. And I think at that time he was actually doing a master's in sociology.
Yeah.
And I was just so taken with, this man's brain and his ideas and the way that he saw that whole kind of process of trying to build leadership in young men's lives and trying to give them a sense of purpose. And he talked about that as being very much aligned with military principles and how by using military principles in the jail, he was turning these young men's lives around. And notably, one of the young men who was part of that group, who was actually the one member who was non-Indigenous, was actually a young fellow called Kirby Brownlow. And Kirby was ex-army in that he'd been an infantryman, a rifleman.
Yeah.
He'd essentially got himself into a spot of bother when he was still in. Got involved with a bit of drink and drugs, and and understandably, and he paid for his crimes, and essentially Army had discharged him and thrown him out. But the effect on him as a young man, just to see him as a young veteran who essentially had lost his way, I just became really interested in how, if you take a wrong path, if things don't work out for you, what that can mean for some of the brightest and best if they're not given the correct leadership and guidance at the right time in the right way. So I think that was probably a real turning point in getting me interested in veterans' issues, and particularly in veteran incarceration.
What I'm most impressed about is that, one, you willingly walked into Port Augusta Prison. That's I've been to Port Augusta. I wouldn't even say that I willingly drove through the town. I'm really impressed also that you remember that I'm a criminologist. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking for a consulting criminologist, just send us an email and I can come and solve all your crime problems, or at least tell you whether or not you have crime. Now, a few years ago, this passion for understanding veterans and their role and the effects on them manifests itself in a program that you founded. And I mentioned this a little bit in your bio. It's called StoryRight, and it's aimed at supporting members of the military who are transitioning to civilian employment. It's something I'm quite familiar with recent experience. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what the program is at StoryRight?
Sure. So, look, how it came about was when I was deployed to Taji in Iraq, was 3 years ago now, actually. Yep. In fact, 3 years ago, I was there. I got really struck by the fact that storytelling, when it's done well, And when an individual who's telling their story genuinely feels empowered and invested in the process, how it can be really quite transformative. And let me just give you some examples. In that, when I was at Taji, we had this kind of tradition of putting together what you would know very well as a former public affairs officer yourself, is the classic hometowner.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially where you've got a young person who's on operations, who's got a hometown obviously back here in Australia, and you write a kind of local boy, local girl type story who's on ops with the Army or Air Force or is away with the Navy, and then that's then placed back in the community newspaper in the town that they're from, and that's called a hometowner story. And essentially, when I was away in Taji, I saw the potential for these, and I had some great support through my public affairs chain of command. And essentially, we started trying to smash as many of these out as possible. And I think during the course of our deployment, we had a minimum of 70 of these published.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where, there was one or two that we got into papers, and of course, those who were featured ended up telling their mates and saying, hey, this is cool. My grandma saw this back home. It was in the local paper or whatever. And suddenly I had lots of members of the task group knocking on my door saying, hey, can I do one of these? So I then sort of set up actually a writers group called the Taji Times Writers Group. And I actually taught them how to write themselves.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, in fact, I'm absolutely bloody snowed under here. Let's teach the members of the task group how to write these hometowners themselves, which many of them did. And just by doing that, by learning how to talk about their military experiences and what they were doing on operations, and learning how to write about that in a way that their civilian friends and family back home could understand, I could see how empowering that was for them.
Yeah.
And I could see what the result was in terms of their self-confidence, self-belief, and frankly, that sense of pride and identity. So when I got back from operations, I kind of had this brainwave in that for some years I've been running workshops in the civilian world, essentially to pay for my, feed my family and pay my mortgage. And these workshops that I've been doing alongside my journalistic work, which frankly pays nothing.
Yeah.
And with these workshops, I've been teaching people how to communicate in order to achieve a strategic objective from a communications perspective. So I thought, well, how about we bring this idea of the hometowner together with the workshop and essentially come up with a workshop where, veterans can come along, learn how to tell their story in a way that's meaningful to help them to get a job.
Yeah.
Quite plain and simple. And that was where StoryRight was born.
Something that, as many of the veterans from, the Five Eyes nations, the Western nations, would understand that the benefits and value of being in the military is quite good a lot of times when you're in there, although I do know that some of our stateside brethren in the US have a lot of trouble with housing and healthcare for veterans. But it doesn't necessarily prepare you to for that transitional moment. I mean, the first time I booked a doctor's appointment for myself, I was like, and listeners, I'm going to give away my age, so you're all going to think I'm remarkably good looking for my age. But, I was 37 the first time I called up a general practitioner and booked an appointment. And I had to ask people, is that it? Is that all I do? And then do I pay them money? Luckily enough, I was able to bill the Department of Veterans Affairs for the appointment, and that kind of felt normal for me, like it was in the military. But it's interesting that you identified something about the military, was that they train these people to be very capable human beings in some very, very broad areas, but they're specifically broad. But life skills that they teach them are maybe a little bit different. And the program for StoryRight aims at helping them communicate their value. And this is primarily to non-defence audiences. Now, I realised at my first Defence or Veterans Employment Expo, in fact, the one I was hired from, there's a lot of industry and employers out there that are interested in hiring veterans because they know that they come from value-based organisations. They know that they've got a lot of skills, but they may not know how to communicate that. And I'll make no bones about it, listeners. The guest on the other end of the microphone actually proofread my CV before I went and found myself a civilian job, because what you do at StoryRight is You help them communicate their value to non-defence audiences. Why is it so important in the way that they communicate their value?
Oh, look, I mean, because when I started to dig down into this and start to investigate what was actually playing out for people, is that the feedback I got time and again is that so many young veterans feel that the civilian world doesn't give them a fair go. And the reason they feel that way is because when they apply for jobs, they, put together their resume. They put together perhaps a personal statement or brief bio, brief biography. And the problem is that the civilian world just doesn't get the language that they're using. Not only that, but they haven't perhaps framed what they've done in the military in a way that a civilian employer can get the value from that employer's perspective. And I'll give you a couple of really good examples. So there's a whole bunch of things we do during the workshop, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. But the absolute core piece of work we do is late morning, where we get the participants to really drill down into their skills. And the way we get them to do that is to think hard about their skills in 4 different categories. So we get them to think about their all core skills, their trade skills, their rank skills, and their civilian skills.
Yeah.
And then what we get them to do is to document all of those skills. And then we get them to think about how they could reframe, reposition, and therefore retell those skills, effectively construct a narrative around that, which will then work for a civilian audience. So if I give you an example here, and I've just got a page out of our workshop manual in front of me where we've got the military speak version and then we've got the civilian speak version.
Perfect.
So classic is military speak. I'm qualified on the EF-88. Now, we all know okay? We know how to shoot the service rifle, okay? Now, how do we translate that so a civilian employer doesn't just think we're a bunch of gun-toting nut jobs that run around with rifles and that we have some value attached to this from a corporate or a civilian perspective? Well, we've translated that as I have experience in using and maintaining complex technical equipment.
Perfect.
Because that is the skill that brings to us, okay? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff we could throw in there about risk management, about maintenance skills, about, technical proficiency, eye for detail, all that kind of stuff. I'll give you one other example before, and you'll know this one very well, Mick. I have been a staff officer, and I think you'll recognise that. Okay, so how do we translate that for a civilian employer? Well, you could translate that, and I wonder if this appeared on your resume. I am highly experienced in personnel and project management, which indeed you are as a staff officer, right?
It's almost a line I think we put on my resume, which now I'm snowed under in project management roles, but it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I mean, there'll be doubters and cynics listening to this episode, and some of those will be in the military. You're saying it sounds like business speak or corporate swank, but it's important because it's actually the language that future employers of veterans will understand. And I guess from my point of view, for the listeners out there, I didn't go through the StoryRight program just because it's run in a state that I have an aversion to ever attending and visiting, Sharon's home state, her adopted home state. I'd happily go back to Essex any day of the week. But the important thing is that veterans get frustrated, right? Like, it's a frustrating experience for them not being able to communicate, just like it is for a toddler who is on the verge of being able to speak a language but can't quite. Now, I'm not comparing all the veterans out there to toddlers, but a lot of you are babies. There's also I think there's a mistranslation for staff officer though. I think have experience in completing slave labor would probably be a little bit closer in my mind. Or that's pretty much it. Personal attendant, indentured servant. Those words came to mind. I think they're the ones we removed from my resume. Now, some of those activities you mentioned sound kind of interesting, particularly with the type of people that are doing the workshops. You've got everyone from infantrymen to flight officers to leading seamen. So there's quite a broad range of people that come through the StoryRight program. So what sort of activities could a participant, whether they're land, air, or water based, what could they expect during one of your workshops?
Yeah, so look, it's there's a bit of theory, but the focus is on practicality and on practice. So what we do is, people rock up in the morning around, we start at 9 o'clock, and the classic is we do get a number of people who are referred to us by the Soldier Recovery Centre here in South Australia, up
Yeah.
at RAF Edinburgh. And we also get a few people sent to us by rehabilitation providers and some other ex-service organisations. And it's kind of interesting because when everyone comes into the room, they kind of sit down and you can see that they're sometimes sort of looking at each other and looking at us and thinking, what bloody hell am I doing here? And by about sort of, I'd say, 10:30, we've kind of completely turned them around in that we start off by just getting them to think differently about the act of communication. So most people go into any communicative process thinking, what do I want to say? Whereas we get them to think, what does the other person need to hear? So as you would know from the information operations work you did when you were still in Army, it's really that strategic thinking, strategic targeting. It's targeting.
Yeah, brilliant.
That's what we do.
Yeah, it's like it must be interesting in those first few moments, just watching, for anyone that's served in the military. And I apologise to the listeners that haven't, but the look soldiers, sailors, and airmen give each other when they're trying to figure out who's who in the zoo, especially when there's the officer that really owns their rank, and is uncomfortable wearing civilian clothes around people who are maybe a lower rank, but they can't quite tell. So it must be a fascinating environment. I'm going to have to get myself along to one of these workshops. Maybe I'll. No, I'm not going to quit my job so that I have to do one. But I'm keen to know what the future holds for StoryRight and your team.
Yeah, cool. So essentially, we've had a lot of interest interstate. So we are looking at rolling out a workshop in collaboration with RSL Queensland fairly soon, because you may have heard some publicity that RSL Queensland have recently launched their veteran employment support program, which is a significant program that, although it's being run out of Queensland, is actually national in scope.
Yeah.
And they came and viewed our workshop last year down here in Adelaide and were really keen on it, and they very much want to integrate that into what they're doing. So we're in discussions with them about achieving that. And we're also hoping to bring it to Canberra, as you know, and we've also offered it in Darwin. We did that last year. We've got some facilitators in training located up there. And look, there's also been interest from the New South Wales state government. So, there's lots of interest happening around the country. So, look, we're really hoping that in time we can get out to people that want the support. But in the meantime, we're also looking at online delivery. So there is something called the Veteran Wellbeing Seminar Series, which is run out of Sydney by a fantastic lady called Jackie van der Velde. And indeed, we're looking at having some taster sessions of StoryRight integrated into the Veteran Wellbeing Summits at least twice this year.
Right.
And that's a way that we'll be able to then offer it online, and veterans will be able to access the materials regardless of where they're located in Australia. So it really means we can get out there and do some outreach work. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And the other thing is, in parallel, we've also, we were successful this year in securing a grant through a not-for-profit that we're affiliated with, who auspice us, which is also based in South Australia.
Yeah.
We were fortunate through that relationship to be able to get a DVA grant to put together a complementary workshop program called Mind Right, which is actually about shifting your psychology as part of the transition process to be able to embrace what you need to do to be able to thrive in a civilian environment. So we're not just looking at the language, we're also looking at the psychology and the mindset as well.
Excellent. Mind right sounds good. Sounds not quite like brainwashing, but I mean, if you brainwash someone to get a job, I guess that's not really a problem. Hey, everyone will be happy with it. There's quite an expansion, and ladies and gents, we've focused a fair bit on this particular program because I think it highlights the value veterans can have for civilian employment, but also the challenges that they face. And it's worth noting again that this program is a not-for-profit. So, Sharon, if you had have incorporated in a different way, you could be sitting on some piles of cash right now. But I'm quite proud to know that it's a not-for-profit that you and your team run for people. So
Oh, absolutely. I mean, same as you, Mick. I mean, we do it for love.
Yeah.
And although we've tried to create employment opportunities for some of the young veterans we work with to actually train to be facilitators, all of us that work on it are volunteers.
Yeah.
So, we've managed to create a couple of employment opportunities for young vets, but certainly, I've always done it for free because I just want to make it work, and I just love it. I just really want to do this work.
I'm hoping that some of my my parliamentarians that clearly I have a lot of parliamentarians who are listeners of the show. I can't actually confirm that, but they should be. I knew I did have one. I'm not sure if he still listens. And I did have a former PM who had this show presented in his weekend brief for a year. I'm not sure if he ever listened to it though, but he exited in a bad way anyway. So there's no need on dragging that out. But if any of you are still out there listening, parliamentarians, get behind it, start supporting some of these programs. Now, we're going to have a quick pause for what I like to call the cheapskates who just listen to the free version of the show, who are no longer going to be called cheapskates. They're going to be called future TDP community members because they're so keen to subscribe to the new community. But we'll have a pause for a moment so we can move on to our bonus content. And wow, what an amazing answer to an amazing question that was. I would have hated to have missed that if I was a listener of the show. All right, Sharon, let's get to the final question now. I'm not sure if our streaming service is going to cut out while we're doing this question, so we might have to repeat it. And I'm mainly just mentioning that because my editing is so sloppy, I can just keep this in as an excuse. Now, our final question, you've actually answered once before in episode 20. And now here we are in episode 89. I think it's 89. Episode 89. Yeah. The Forgotten Bastards was episode 88. So I can't remember what your answer was last time. And if I was a good host, I would have gone back and listened to it. But I'm not. I'm a rubbish host. So, Sharon, my final question is one that I ask all guests. In fact, it's one I've asked of you before. And it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So right now, I ask you to finish the sentence war is.
War is unimaginable.
I like the succinct aspect of your nature. We don't get that so often, although I've had a run of succinct answers, so that's kind of good. I thought you were going to say war is a really good reason to start a not-for-profit that helps people get employment, but that's okay. It is unimaginable, and it's surreal for those of us who have experienced it. Although I mostly just drank lattes. Sharon, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about the work you're doing in helping veterans understand how they can communicate with future civilian employers better and helping the young men and women in Australia of their, the Australian Defence Force find jobs. So thank you for your work, but also thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, look, thanks for having me, Mick. It's always an absolute pleasure to have a chat with you, and I do miss our fun times that we used to have on Exercise Hamel together. That was jolly, wasn't it?
It was an excellent environment to produce Army's first podcast. I may or may not have mentioned that before, ladies and gentlemen. Also, one thing Sharon did do, and I didn't mention it, she also produced the Australian Defence Force's first podcast from an operational theatre. So she's quite the trailblazer and fairly humble. So I will make sure that I am arrogant for her. Now, you should follow Sharon on Twitter at Sharon Mascall. That's Sharon spelt the normal way, Shazza, kidding, SharonMascall. And you should also do everyone a favour and check out www.storyright.org. You can learn a fair bit from the website on the good work Sharon and her team are doing. Also, another thing you should do is you should subscribe to the new TDP community. I'm not sure if you've got that impression enough yet on this episode, but hey, it's my first episode since launching, and I'm really proud of the number of early adopters we've got, and also proud of how our first writing sprint went, as well as our first book club coming up. Our first book club in the TDP community is a book called Bodies of Men by Nigel Featherstone. It's an Australian fiction work, and it is one you will not have read the like of. And listeners know I read quite a bit. I've never read a book like it, and I found it absolutely remarkable. I probably only gave it 4 stars if I found it remarkable. Takes a lot to get a 5-star out of me. Actually, no, you get 5 stars if you swear generally in a book from me. But listeners, until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.